Hello everyone, I hope you're doing okay. Today we're talking about the Carnage Marauder, the spec that you play when you want to feel superior to the people that are playing Fury and Annihilation. Two disclaimers. One, I'm not an expert on this spec, I'm just a nerd, I play a lot of SWTOR, I kind of know what I'm doing, but if there's anything that I missed, anything you recommend, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I'm sure your fellow players would appreciate it. Secondly, Carnage is definitely a labor of love right now. The spec is kind of hot dog water, it doesn't do a whole lot of damage, but it has some decent burst windows. It's not great, not terrible. I wouldn't really recommend playing it right now, but if you want to have some fun, have some major burst, it can be a good time. So with those out of the way, let's jump right into it. Tertiary stats. Accuracy in PvE, 110% every single time. It's pretty much mandatory. Accuracy in PvP, you can kind of dump it all. You don't really need it. For your alacrity, you can either have the fat, dank 4.20% alacrity, blaze it up, or you can have the 12.4% alacrity. Now, if you don't have the gear to reach that 12.4% alacrity, don't really worry about it. Just settle for that 4.2%. You should be ready to rock and roll. If you don't hit the threshold, it doesn't really do much for us in this spec. So either 420 blaze it up, or if you can get there, 12.4. Then throw everything else into crit and you should be ready to rock and roll. Now let's talk about our tactical. Malevolence is kind of the go-to here for PvE and PvP numbers farming, but if you're going to be playing ranked PvP, take the Fell Splice Genes. It's just kind of the best for getting out of combat relatively frequently. But for now, we're talking about Malevolence, going to make our gore essentially do more free dot damage. It's pretty darn nice. Fearless Victor for our Legendary is going to give us 10% free melee damage. It's nice. It's real nice. Dispatch Package is going to help us manage our rage by giving us rage every single time we hit with a crit. It's pretty darn nice. Additionally, every time you use your dual saber throw, your next vicious throw is going to automatically crit. It's kind of a good time. Looking at the tree really quickly, Berserker's Gore is going to give us multiple gores and give us more gore damage. It's pretty darn nice. Predation. It's predation. It's movement speed. It's kind of the best. Frenzy Blade is going to give us more crit chance on Massacre. Pretty darn nice. Swiftness is going to give us flat crit chance. We do a whole lot of crits in this spec. It's pretty darn nice. Defensive Roll is great for PvE, for like dealing with AoE damage. I've seen some people in PvP taking Interloper for the extra leap. It's kind of up to you. PvP, I take Blood Ward here for the extra healing under Saber Ward and the CC immunity. It's pretty darn nice. But in PvE, a lot of people taking actually Cloak of Retribution for the extra Cloak of Pains. It's kind of up to you. I can see both ways. And then if you want to just like AoE number farm, Path Carver, totally fine. Next in 68, all these are perfectly viable. You either have the defensive cooldown of Undying Rage. It's very nice. You can take Mad Dash for the movement speed. It's very nice. Or you can take Choke for the CC. Very nice. Pick poison here. I usually take Undying Rage. And then finally, I take Thirst for Rage for the flat, like 2.5k healing per second. Beats Poke in the eye. It's not great, not terrible, but it's better than the rest of these two options here. So it's kind of what I run with. All right, let's talk very quickly about our energy management systems here in Carnage. We have two essentially resources that we need to be managing. The first is our Rage. Rage are these little yellow bubbles that appear under your health bar here. Rage is built by low damaging abilities, and then we spend our rage on high damaging abilities. We have three primary ways of generating this rage. The first is with our Force Charge. Force Charge is our leap. It'll build 3 rage right away. It's pretty darn nice. Doesn't do a whole lot of damage, but it is a leap, and especially for a spell like this where it's a melee, leaps are kind of important to have. So Force Charge, very nice ability. The second ability that we have is our Battering Assault. Battering Assault will generate 6 rage. Doesn't do a whole lot of damage. However, 6 rage is a whole lot of rage. We want to be spamming Battering Assault pretty much as often as possible, especially in a spec like this where it is very demanding on our rage generation. Battering Assault is going to be your best friend. However, if Battering Assault is off cooldown, we do have our final way of really generating rage in the form of our Assault. Assault is a sad little ability. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage. However, it does generate 2 rage, and it buys you time to get more Battering Assaults back. So Assault, not the greatest ability in the world. However, it does build 2 rage, and especially in a spec like this where we will be consuming rage all the time, it's pretty darn nice. So those are 3 ways to be generating rage. Again, Force Charge, Battering Assault for major force generation, and then finally regular assault for sad force generation, or rage generation. I'm sorry. That's the first resource we have to manage, but we actually have two resources to manage here. The second resource is our Fury. Every time you do damage that consumes Rage, you will slowly build up to these 30 stacks of Fury. When you hit these 30 stacks, you will see that your Berserk button is going to start to glow. What Berserk does is it gives you 30% alacrity, so it makes you move very, very quickly. It makes your abilities activate faster. It's kind of a lot of fun when you feel it hit. Additionally, it's going to make our gores not go on cooldown, because if you remember, we took the Berserker's gore. So that means that if you go into Berserk, we can use gore just back to back to back every time we use gore under Berserk. It's pretty darn nice. And finally, it's going to make our Ferocity have one more charge than it usually does. We'll talk about all these later on and how we're going to be using them. Just know that for right now, Berserk, go faster, makes gore not go on cooldown, and it makes Ferocity essentially give you more Ferocity. It makes you more furious, as it were. All right? That's kind of the fundamentals of what you need to know. Oh, and it makes some of your abilities consume less Rage. So we want to be pretty much smacking our Berserk all the time. Our goal is to be juggling our Rage to the point where we can be spending our high damaging abilities to build up to those 30 stacks, and then we can spend those 30 stacks on our Berserks, and then hopefully be combining all of our high damaging abilities back to back to back. So, we've covered the basics. Generating Rage, Leap, Battering Assault, Assault, spending that Rage to get Fury, have 30 stacks of Fury, Berserk, go fast, whole bunch of abilities do a lot more. But let's talk about actually doing damage here. The fundamental of Carnage comes down to this Ataru form. You get Ataru form right away, and what it means is that every time you hit the target, there's a small chance that you will generate an additional Ataru form strike that does like 4 to 6k damage. It's not a whole lot of damage, but it's free. So we want to be attacking as often as possible to trigger these Ataru form strikes. Now, you can do that from just like regularly attacking the target. However, it's not that consistent, and it's not as frequent that we're going to be triggering these extra strikes. The most efficient way to generate these strikes is actually with this first ability here called Massacre. Massacre is the Massacre is the spam ability. If you see a Carnage Marauder, they're probably hitting the button of Massacre, okay? Massacre is the button that you hit when you don't know what else to hit. It has absolutely no cooldown. It consumes a fair bit of Rage, but not a whole lot, and it triggers an additional Ataru form strike every single time. That's what makes it special. So every time you hit the Massacre button, it's going to trigger an Ataru form strike and get you that extra bit of free damage. So it's not just doing, 12, 14, 17k damage. It's also triggering that extra free 6k damage of Ataru form every single time. But it's not just about like generating those extra strikes. We actually see some benefits of having an Ataru form strike happen in the form of Vicious Throw and Devastating Blast start to glow. Every time that you trigger an Ataru form strike, once every 20 seconds, your Vicious Throw is going to start to glow. What this means is that you can now use Vicious Throw on any target regardless of their current health pool. This isn't the way it usually works. Usually it has to be below 30% health. However, this is our first hard-hitting ability. Every 20 seconds, thanks to our little debuff right here of Slaughter, you have an Ataru form strike happen. You can now use Vicious Throw. This, when combined with Dual Saber Throw, which is, if you remember from our legendary here, gives us a crit on our Vicious Throw, means that we could be essentially auto-critting our Vicious Throw relatively frequently. So, it is the first way our Ataru form strikes really help us out here. Every time you get an Ataru form strike, you're going to see Vicious Throw starts to glow. Pretty darn nice. It means we can use it and do a whole bunch of damage. The second way it helps us out is that every time you trigger an Ataru form strike, you're going to see this little buff of Execute, and our Devastating Blast is going to start to glow. This means that Devastating Blast is going to crit and do more damage. So, boop, does a whole bunch of damage, all because we got an Ataru form strike to trigger, thanks to our Massacre. These are two of our hard-hitting abilities here. You can see every time we get an Ataru form strike, we can use Dual Saber Throw. We can go like back-to-back crits of Vicious Throw and then Devastating Blast. Two hard-hitting abilities. We love to see it. The third hard-hitting ability we need to worry about here is our Gore. Now, Gore on its own, It does an okay amount of damage, like 22k damage. Not great, not terrible. However, it also sunders the target, which means that it's going to take more damage from all sources, and it's going to apply our bleed from our from our tactical. All right, so because of our tactical, we get the extra bleed on our gore, which is going to make it do more free damage, which is very, very nice. Gore is our third hard-hitting ability. So those three hard-hitting abilities one more time. Vicious Throw, when it glows, pretty hard-hitting ability. Devastating Blast, when it glows, pretty hard-hitting ability. And Gore, when it's just available, does a fair bit of damage. These are the three abilities that we want to be using during our burst windows. But Biggs, how do I set up a burst window? Well, I'm glad you asked me. We finally need to talk about our Ferocity. Ferocity gives you 100% armor penetration on your hard-hitting abilities. So what does that mean? It means that they all essentially do more damage. So if you remember before, our abilities were doing like, 30k on a crit, but if we activate Ferocity, we are now going to be doing like 50k on a crit, or 50k again on a crit, back to back to back. Essentially, whenever you hit your Ferocity here, you're going to see that you get stacks of armor penetration in the form of this little pink guy with his two lightsabers looking very fabulous. And what this means is that your next two hard-hitting abilities will do more damage for free. It's our little way of generating burst windows. In a perfect world, we would be using our Ferocity on only these abilities of Vicious Throw, Devastating Blast, and Gore. Just because they hit the hardest, and therefore, we should be focusing them on hitting those massive armor penetrations. So, one more time, Ferocity makes our Vicious Throw and our Devastating Blast and our Gore all hit relatively harder depending on how many stacks you have. You can use your Ferocity stacks on like a Massacre, but that's kind of sad. So try to avoid it if you can. We want to be specifically spending these stacks on Vicious Throw, Devastating Blast, and Gore. There is an additional interaction here. We actually mentioned it before, and that's the fact that if you use your Ferocity under your Berserk, you will get 3 stacks of Ferocity, which I know is just mind-blowing. So you can see here we have Berserk. If we use Ferocity, we now have 3 stacks of Ferocity, which means we can use Vicious Throw, Devastating Blast, and Gore all back to back to back under Ferocity and do a whole bunch of damage. This means you can do like 150k damage in like 3 global cooldowns. It's a fair bit of damage. Additionally, if you remember before, when we activate Berserk, our Gore no longer goes on cooldown. So what that means is that you can go like Gore and then Vicious Throw, and then you can use a Devastating Blast for all your Ferocity windows, and then you can still have a Gore for later. So it's nice. It's a nice little interaction. We'll talk about that in a hot second. So, zoom it back very quickly. Massacre triggers Ataru Form Strikes. Ataru Form Strikes makes our Vicious Throw and Devastating Blast glow. Using Dual Saber Throw makes your Vicious Throw automatically crit, which means that we can have a massive burst window of Vicious Throw, Devastating Blast, and Gore all hitting the target very, very hard. Additionally, when you use your Berserk, we're going to go Berserk, it's going to mean that our Berserk is going to, our Ferocity will have 3 stacks. So now, instead of just having 2 stacks of Ferocity, we now have 3, so we can use all of our hard-hitting abilities back to back to back. It's very, very nice. Let's talk about one more ability here in the form of our Ravage. Ravage is essentially free damage. It doesn't consume any rage. It's kind of an ability that you use when you don't have anything else to hit or like you're running out of rage. It's not great, not terrible. It does fit in the actual rotation. However, it's not that impressive. You don't really have to think about it. Just hit it when you feel like it. All right? It's not exactly a hard hitting ability. It's just a hitting ability. Okay? Now, there are 2 ways to play this spec. They both revolve around a basic premise. However, if you want to learn a rotation and do a whole bunch of damage and not think, go play Fury. That's my God's honest opinion. Fury is way outperforming. If you rather follow a strict rotation, go do that. We'll talk about the rotation, don't you worry. Just know that it's not my recommendation if you just want to follow rotation here. All right. So the fundamental idea behind doing damage in this spec is we're going to have a Berserk Ferocity, then we're going to fill, then we're going to have an Unberserk Ferocity, and then we're going to fill. So not following any rotation whatsoever here. If we jump in, we generate a little bit of rage. If we go a Berserk Ferocity, we have Ferocity ready to rock and roll. We have our 3 stacks. We can go back to back to back with our hard-hitting abilities. And then we fill until we have our second Ferocity window. Minor Ferocity, we can go like Gore, Devastating Blast. And then we fill our way back up to 30 Berserk. All right? So the whole core concept comes down to have your major Berserk ready. So if we go Berserk into our major hard-hitting Ferocity window, boop, 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 and then we essentially fill until we have our next Ferocity window ready to rock and roll for our minor Ferocity, boop, boop, and now we just fill until we have our 30 stacks of Fury again. All right? So, Berserk, major burst window of Ferocity, Dual Saber Throw, Vicious Throw, Devastating Blast, Gore, and now we fill until we have our second minor Ferocity ready to rock and roll of Gore, Devastating Blast, and now we fill until we have our 30 stacks of Fury again. This is kind of the boring way, or not boring way. This is the fun way to play this spec, if I'm being honest with you, that you're not really following a set rotation. You're just trying to get to that 30 stacks. Berserk, Ferocity, Vicious Throw, use, please, Devastating Blast, Gore, and now we just fill our way to our next burst window of Gore and Devastating Blast, and then we fill our way back up to 30. You're not going to do the most damage in this spec anyways, I'll be honest with you. It's just like the fundamental ideas of like, hey, here's what you should be doing. Filling in with Battering Assault, Massacre, and Assault to get your way back up to 30 Fury, and then we're ready to rock and roll again with Big Berserk into Ferocity, Vicious Throw, Devastating Blast, Gore, and then we fill from here to our next burst window, to our minor burst, Gore, Devastating Blast, back to 30, and then repeat until the end of time. Now I have to teach you the world's most god-awful rotation. All right? If you don't want to play that way, if you don't want to play the dummy way of just big burst, fill, little burst, fill, here's the actual proper rotation. Okay? We'll go through this a couple times. Frankly, I'll post a picture of it down in the comments below. It's kind of a pain in the neck, so let's quickly talk about it. So if we jump in, we're going to go Berserk, Massacre to trigger our Ataru form, Battering Assault to make sure we have the rage to go, Dual Saber Throw to make sure that we have the auto crit, Major Burst Window, Ferocity, Devastating Blast, or Vicious Throw, Devastating Blast, Gore, and now we go Massacre, Assault, Massacre, Battering Assault, back to our minor burst window of Ferocity, Gore, Devastating Blast, and now we fill with Massacre, Ravage, Massacre, Massacre, and now we begin again. All right, so Berserk, Massacre, Battering Assault, Dual Saber Throw, Major Burst Window. Now we rebuild with Massacre, Assault, Massacre, Battering Assault, Minor Burst Window. Now we fill back up to the top with Massacre, Ravage, Massacre, Massacre, begin. Massacre, Battering Assault, Dual Saber Throw to set everything up for our Major Burst Window. Then Massacre, Assault, Massacre, Battering Assault to kind of rebuild the forge here into our Minor Burst Window. And now we fill back up to 30 stacks of Fury with Massacre, Ravage, Massacre, 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 Battering Assault, Dual Saber Throw to our Major Burst Window. And then we rebuild the forge of Massacre, Assault, Massacre, Battering Assault into our Minor Burst Window. Then we rebuild all the way up to 30 stacks over and over and over again. This is the fundamental rotation behind this spec. Sometimes you'll see here, you won't have Vicious Throw proccing. That's kind of sad. So what you do is you essentially fill with Massacre during that time. It kind of just is what it is. Sometimes it falls out of favor. It just kind of is the way it goes. But instead of using Vicious Throw, you can just use a regular Massacre and you should be ready to rock and roll. So that way, when the rotation comes around again, you'll be ready to go. That's really all there is to say about this spec, I'll be honest with you. It's a fun time, especially when you're aiming to line up those major burst windows. To be honest with you, if you're looking to play PvE, you can memorize this rotation, but it's a lot more fun in like PvP when you're running in and you're trying to hit these massive burst windows of jumping in, going berserk ferocity, trying to make sure that you're landing those massive burst windows on people, because they can hit like a train. It's just everything else in between is kind of slow. So do what you will with that information. I've laid it out for you. You can now do with it as you see fit. Let's briefly talk about our defensive cooldowns here. Saber Ward is going to increase your range defenses by 50%. It's going to absorb 25% of your damage taken. It's a fine ability, not great, not terrible, but it beats a poke in the eye. Cloak of Pain is going to reduce the damage you take by 20%, and it's going to attack any attackers that hit you for like 2.7k damage. Not great, not terrible. It's great for fluffing. And every time you're attacked, it will also refresh up to a total of 30 seconds. So if you have like a dot on you and you really want to fluff, just hit your Cloak of Pain, and then it will trigger damage to your attacker over and over and over again and keep it refreshing over and over. It's pretty darn nice. I personally take Undying Rage for the 99% DR. It's pretty nice, especially for like cheesy mechanics, but it's really up to you. And then finally, we have our Force Camouflage. Force Camouflage is going to reduce your threat, and it's going to make you semi-invisible for a couple of seconds here. It's pretty darn nice. And then finally, we're also taking Predation, which is going to make you zoom and go faster. It's a fun little ability here. All right? All right. One more thing before we get this show on the road. We can use our Frenzy to immediately build 30 stacks of Fury. In combat, out of combat, doesn't really matter. Additionally, anytime you use a regen, it will build 30 stacks of Fury. Can't really do it in combat, but if you're leading up into combat, you can totally use your regen, and then you should be ready to rock and roll. You will also notice this ability here called Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst is going to increase the damage of your entire raid team by 10% for 10 seconds, but it's going to consume all 30 stacks of your Fury. Essentially, you only want to use your Bloodthirst if you have your Frenzy available. So that way you can build the first Berserk organically, and then you can use Frenzy and use your Bloodthirst afterwards. So that way you're not completely destroying your rotation. So you can do something like Leap In, Frenzy, hit the target, get going, and then use your Frenzy into Bloodthirst when you're doing your massive burst window, and that way you can hit like a train, and then just dive into your rotation here. This spec can be fun. I personally, it's okay. You know, I'll dabble with it. You know, we'll mess around from time to time. Not always exactly my cup of tea, but if it's yours, have at it, Hoss. This has been the Carnage Marauder Guide. I hope you have enjoyed. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. I'm sure fellow players would appreciate it. Otherwise, that's kind of all that I have. Missing anything? Duke went from very awake to very asleep, like very quickly. The man's kind of an animal, kind of nuts. Like and comment and subscribe, or don't. I'm not your mom. You do whatever you want to. And I hope you're having a grand old day. We're coming down to the end of these, so we're almost done with this guide adventure. So I hope this has been enjoyable for you, and I hope you have a grand old day. All right. Peace.